Hi, welcome to my very first video. If you don't know me, my name is Jess Killinger and I'm an architect in Colorado. I'm really excited to get to share this project. It's a thrift flip and I took a round mirror and turned it into a magenta and gold sunburst mirror. I really hope you love it. Let's get started. We found this mirror at a thrift store for $8. I immediately bought it. I was really excited about this find. However, I have to be honest. When I started thinking through the logistics, I got a little skeptical that this could work, mainly because the original mirror was already 3.5 feet in diameter, and that's big. And then the reason sunburst mirrors really work is because the rays typically extend several inches past the frame. So that meant the mirror had to get bigger. Luckily, in our house, we have a 2-story tall wall in the front room. Because of that, I decided that the proportions of this gigantic sunburst mirror will work on that wall. When you update an existing piece, prep is key. This frame had a shiny lacquer finish, and I sanded that down so the new paint could have a better grip on the surface. While sanding, I realized that this frame is made of a thin particle board, and the face of it was warped in areas. I used some wood filler to try to even out the surface, and after that dried, I sanded it down smooth. I cleaned off all the dust with a tack cloth and put painter's tape down to protect the mirror, and then I primed. After some discussion, Josh and I decided to paint the frame a really fun, bold magenta color called Wild Berry by Behr. I looked at a lot of different options to make these rays for this design. I started by going to the arts and crafts store and looking at dowels and basswood, and they were just too small for the proportions of this mirror. So I ended up going to Home Depot and looking at the trim aisle because those will be a little bit bigger. While I was there, I stumbled across window shims. I immediately knew that was what I was going to use for my project. Now, these were never meant to be a finished product. I knew this was going to take a lot of work to get it sanded down to be a nice product. So once I found these, Josh and I decided on a pattern that was a simple big, small around the mirror. Then I had to do some math. We agreed that we wanted space between each ray so that we could see the magenta all the way through. I also liked this approach because if I had butted them up against each other real tight, then at the end of the pattern, I would have ended up with an odd-shaped one. That really wasn't the look I wanted to go for. I know most people probably wouldn't have noticed it, but I would have. So step 1, to figure out the spacing, I laid out all the rays in a rough pattern. This made sure I ended up with an equal number of big and small shims. Then I measured the interior circumference with a fabric tape measure because it can follow the curve really nicely. Okay, there's going to be a pretty big margin for error if you get the measurements off, so I kept the measurements pretty tight on this. So when I was measuring, I did measure down to 1/16 of an inch, just so that we could stay as accurate as possible. I knew I needed 48 shims. I measured all the shims and they came out to be, over here for more math, 1 inch and 5/16 on average. I measured several of them. So multiply that by 48. That means in total on the interior circumference of this mirror, I'll have 5'3" of that dimension taken up by shims. Then what we need to know is how much is the inside circumference of this mirror. And I measured that out. We're at 7'10" and 5/16. Again, keeping it pretty tight here because it'll make a big difference.
What that means is total circumference minus the shim width gives us 2 foot 7 5/16. Divide that by 48 times, and we get 21/32 of an inch per space. That might sound a little crazy, but here, let me grab this real quick. Why I'm not worried about it, and I'm going to stick with it, is because if I round this up 1/32 of an inch over 48 spaces, that's going to be a difference of well over 1 inch. So that's why I'm not going to round it up. And the reason I'm not worried about it is because on this tape measure that I have to do the circumference with, these little marks are each 1/16 of an inch. 1/32 of an inch is going to be right smack dab in the mark, and I am capable of putting a pencil mark in between those dashes. I'm going to make myself marks so that I can go around the mirror. I'm going to start at the 10. So our shims are 1 inch and 5/16. The space is 21/32.
Okay, I lined up my first ray with the top of the hanging wire on the back. This way, the topmost ray looks straight when it's hung. I made my first few marks, then I did a quick check with the shims to make sure the spacing looked good. I thought it did, so I started laying out my marks all the way around the interior circumference. After I finished up the marks, it was time to sand. For every shim, I started by putting an X on the roughest side so I didn't waste time sanding it. Then I always put a very light pencil mark before I sand so that I can see when that gets knocked off and I don't oversand.
It's been, I think, 3 days since I started sanding, and I'm not even halfway through. Half of these haven't even gotten the first pass yet. I am going to die of sanding.
This belt sander and orbital sander combo tool is the very first bench tool I've ever owned. However, I don't own a workbench, so I'm gonna have to use this on the ground to be safe. Always read the directions with a new tool. This one needs the tension adjusted so the belt stays centered on the cylinders. I did a pass with an 80 grit and then a 120 grit on the belt sander, and I couldn't find a belt with a finer grit, so I did the last pass by hand. It was definitely worth purchasing the belt sander. We knew we wanted the rays to be gold, and for some reason, I decided to use spray paint, which is really unfortunate because I always try to avoid using spray paint if I can help it, and I ended up painting over the spray paint because this iridescent gold acrylic paint that I have in our craft supplies, I ended up liking the finish a lot better. See, this short one here has been painted with the acrylic. The two behind it have the spray paint on them, and see how the spray paint has a greenish undertone to it, and the acrylic one has this much brighter, warm tone to it. So I decided I'm gonna paint it the color that looks a lot better in my opinion. At this point, I had already painted all of the small shims and I just needed to paint the longer shims. However, there's a lot of small bumps, and I think what happened was I was too heavy-handed with the spray paint and it bubbled up. This is really rough looking and I'm gonna have to sand it off because I worked too hard to get these smooth to not have that really nice smooth finish. Then I have to finish repainting all of these. Pro tip, don't sand inside your house. I was lazy and didn't want to set up outside and I made a gigantic mess. So I don't advise that. So I got everything painted and it's time to glue. I ended up finding this Gorilla Glue super glue gel. I tried that out on the first 3 and it worked like a charm. It didn't set immediately and gave me a few seconds to wiggle them around so that they were perfect before it set. Then I just had to go around the whole mirror and follow my marks and glue them all down. Once everything was glued down, I had to go back and paint on the interior circumference where I had put all those marks. I did 2 coats of paint. Then I took it outside and put a final clear coat on that just to give it that extra level of protection so it'll be easy to clean.
Okay, so the clear coat left a dustiness on top because I went with a dead flat. See how these look dusty and over here they look cleaner? So I've experimented with some 1000 grit sandpaper and some tack cloth, and honestly the tack cloth is knocking it off just as easy as the sandpaper. So I'm gonna knock it off and then I'm gonna hit it very lightly with a lacquer finish to kind of bring some of the shine back to the gold, because we've definitely lost that.
The wind got really bad at this point, but I got that final coat on and let that dry overnight and it looked great and we were ready to hang it.
So what I just did was weighed the mirror. We're at just under 25 pounds. When you start getting with heavier hangs, you want to make sure that you're getting something that can hold up that pressure. All of these will work for our mirror. The deciding factor for me is going to be profile. This hook is a very small profile, and at 45 pounds, it'll definitely hold up our mirror.
Once we figured out how to hang the mirror, we had to figure out where to hang the mirror. Now, I did do this before I glued all the rays on because I didn't want to risk breaking those, and Josh was great. He helped me figure out where it needed to be. Now, I know a lot of designers will be like, you don't want to hang your art too high. They give you a height that you should hang art at, and I just completely disagree with that, because I think it's all about how the negative space is balanced around your art piece. So when Josh was holding up for the test piece, I measured where the bottom was, and then when I had the frame off the wall, I measured the distance from the bottom of the mirror to the top of the hanging wire, and that's how I found the height to put the hook at. So we got the hook up there first, and then it was time to try to hang this thing. And I'll be real honest, this was definitely a 3-buddy job, not a 2-buddy job. We needed 2 people to be able to support the mirror without damaging the rays, and then another person to guide the wire to the hook. So that would have been a lot easier and safer, but we did manage to do it with just the 2 of us, and it looked great. So we got it hung, and that's it for the magenta and gold sunburst mirror. This wall is definitely not finished. It needs something else, like a chair rail or wainscot, or maybe some board and batten. There's places to put sconces, so that would be cute, but it needs something to kind of ground the wall and not make the mirror feel so stark and lonely by itself up there. We are really excited about how this turned out, and I realize it might not be the look everyone would go for, but I'm gonna do a video about how to find your personal style, and I'm gonna really dig into our personal style that we're going for in our home, and hopefully that will explain why this design works so well for our house. Thanks for watching. I hope I'll see you in the next video. Bye!